Britain Unfiltered, and today we are not sugarcoating a single thing. There is a moment, and if you haven't seen it yet, go and find it right now. There is a moment that has been playing on loop across the internet, replayed on news channels, clipped and reshared and memed into the ground, and it shows everything you need to know about where Britain stands in the world right now. Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, the leader of one of the oldest democracies on the face of the earth, walked toward a podium at a peace summit in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt, genuinely believing that Donald Trump had just called him forward to speak. He heard his name. Trump had called out from the lectern, asking where the United Kingdom was, saying, "Where is my friend Starmer?" And so Starmer moved. He stepped forward. He started that slow, slightly awkward, lumbering walk toward the microphone in front of the world's cameras, in front of every major leader on the planet. And then Trump turned his back. Trump turned back to the lectern, kept talking, and left Starmer standing there without an invitation to speak. Starmer quietly returned to his place among the other world leaders as the cameras kept rolling. That was it. That was the moment. Britain's Prime Minister on the world stage walked toward a podium he was never invited to and had to walk back in front of the whole world. Political journalist Dan Hodges put it plainly. Okay, this is utterly humiliating. Keir Starmer thought Trump was inviting him to speak, then had to walk back. And that was from someone in the British press. The reaction online was savage. One X-user said, "I've lost count of how many times Trump has humiliated Starmer this year, but this is by far the best." Now, some people in Starmer's corner tried to spin it. GB News political editor Christopher Hope pointed out that Trump had done something similar to the Pakistani Prime Minister earlier in the same event, suggesting Starmer may have been confused by the pattern. Starmer himself tried to style out the moment by posting a photo of himself with Trump at the lectern, captioning it, "President Trump, this is your achievement." Think about that for a second. The man just got snubbed in front of the world, and his response was to post a photo praising the man who snubbed him. That is either the most diplomatic thing you've ever seen or the most cringeworthy. And depending on your politics, you already know which one you think it is. But let's back up, because this Sharm el-Sheikh moment didn't come from nowhere. To understand it properly, you have to understand the full arc of the Starmer-Trump relationship and what Britain has been willing to sacrifice to maintain the fiction of that so-called special relationship. It started back in February 2025, when the two leaders met in the Oval Office for the first time. Trump asked Starmer, live in front of reporters, whether the British military could take on Russia by themselves. That was Trump's idea of diplomacy. He dodged a question about whether America would actually come to Britain's defense if British troops faced a Russian attack in Ukraine, flipped it around and put it back on Starmer. The British press at the time described Starmer as having crawled, with one commentary saying he simpered like a boss man's clerk. Sky News ran the headline, "Starmer humiliated by Trump and Vance." This was February, month one. And what did Britain get for all that groveling? By March, the UK had been hit with 25% tariffs on steel and aluminum. One commentator wrote that it was a reward for obeisance. Britain had cut its foreign aid budget, slashed welfare for disabled people, which threatened to strip 400,000 disabled people of £5,000 a year in benefits, all to meet Trump's demands, to raise defense spending, to signal that Britain was a reliable partner. And the reward was a tariff, 25% on steel and aluminum from your
Then came the state visit in September 2025, the second state visit. The biggest military honor guard ever assembled, the gold carriages, the banquet at Windsor Castle, King Charles himself praising Trump's personal commitment to finding solutions to the world's most intractable conflicts, the bagpipers at Chequers in a nod to Trump's Scottish heritage. Britain pulled out every single stop. Starmer called Trump "my friend," "our friend" in public, speaking of leaders who respect each other and genuinely like each other. And by all accounts, the atmosphere was warm. Britain announced what it called the biggest investment package of its kind in British history. $250 billion flowing both ways across the Atlantic. They signed a tech deal. They talked about nuclear reactors. Starmer called it a blueprint to win the new era. But then came the tariffs question, the one that mattered most to British industry, the one British steelworkers had been waiting on for months. Talks on lowering steel and aluminium tariffs from 25% to zero had stalled, despite a promise 4 months earlier that the issue would be settled within weeks. A reporter asked Trump directly, would he be willing to cut tariffs on British steel? Trump was non-committal, saying simply, "We're making a lot of money." That was the answer. That was what Britain got after the carriages, the bagpipers, the banquet, and the Winston Churchill archive. "We're making a lot of money." The British Chambers of Commerce said failure to cut those tariffs would be greeted with dismay by the British steel industry. It was greeted with exactly that. And it gets worse, because even after the state visit, even after all the pomp and ceremony, Trump announced 10% tariffs on 8 European countries, including the UK, who opposed US plans to acquire Greenland, with the threat of increasing to 25% by June if a deal wasn't struck for the US to make a complete and total purchase of Greenland. This is where we are. Britain, a nuclear-armed permanent member of the UN Security Council, faces economic punishment for not nodding along to an American president's plan to annex a sovereign territory that belongs to Denmark. And the British government's response? Starmer made an emollient speech assuring people that diplomacy would defuse the crisis. Now, the question people keep dancing around, the one that everyone feels but nobody in the mainstream press quite wants to say out loud, is this: what exactly does Britain get from the special relationship? Because from the outside looking in, it looks like a very one-sided transaction. Britain performs loyalty, Britain raises defense spending, Britain cuts aid budgets and welfare programs and fires ambassadors, Britain rolls out gold carriages and King himself, and in return, America imposes tariffs, refuses to commit to defending British troops, demands Britain not recognize Palestine, threatens to punish Britain over Greenland, and then, in front of the cameras of the world, doesn't even let the British Prime Minister finish his walk to the podium.
On the day of the summit, it happened to be the centenary of Margaret Thatcher's birth. Former Sky News presenter Colin Brazier posted, "Margaret Thatcher was an almost equal partner with Ronald Reagan. Together, they won the Cold War." Thatcher was able to stiffen the spine of President Bush Sr. when he went wobbly on Gulf War I. That's the comparison being made, not by some fringe account, by established commentators. Thatcher and Reagan versus Starmer and Trump. And you don't need to agree with Thatcher's politics to feel the gap that image captures. There was a Britain once that other powers had to reckon with. A Britain that had leverage, a Britain that could stiffen someone's spine. What is the Britain of 2025 doing? It is walking toward a podium it was never invited to and smiling for the photo on the way back. One commentator put it starkly, "When Trump humiliated Keir Starmer on the world stage, it was both highly enjoyable and deeply depressing at the same time." Enjoyable because people have become so frustrated with Starmer's government, with the broken promises, the stalled economy, the welfare cuts, the unpopularity, that watching him squirm has a kind of dark satisfaction to it. Depressing because behind every image of Starmer walking back from that podium is the image of Britain itself. Not Starmer the man, Britain the country, Britain's place in the world, Britain's credibility, Britain's voice. And when that gets mocked, when that gets brushed aside, it isn't Starmer who's embarrassed, it's every person watching from home.
Here's the uncomfortable truth that cuts across party lines. This isn't entirely Starmer's failure. This is a structural problem. One analyst put it plainly: the UK, despite all the humiliation it has suffered, does not seem able to rid itself of the need to rely on the United States, and taking a more independent path requires tolerating great sacrifices, and that requires strong, convincing leadership. Britain has been in the American orbit for 80 years. The dependency has calcified into something that looks less like a partnership and more like a client relationship. And the brutal reality is that when the patron decides to be publicly dismissive, the client has very few moves. You can post a photo and call it a handshake. You can hold a press conference and talk about historic investment packages. You can invoke Churchill, but you can't unring that bell. The world saw it. The cameras were rolling. What would an alternative look like? Britain pivoting more firmly toward Europe, rebuilding that post-Brexit relationship with some urgency, developing an independent foreign policy voice that isn't constantly calibrated around Washington's approval. These aren't radical ideas. They're the kinds of conversations that serious countries have when a major relationship starts producing consistent humiliation with diminishing returns. But those conversations require political courage. They require a leader willing to absorb short-term pain for long-term credibility. And right now, Britain doesn't seem to have that leader. It has a leader who fires ambassadors to avoid embarrassment during a state visit, a leader who cuts welfare to meet defense spending targets demanded by a foreign president, a leader who walks toward a podium he wasn't invited to and smiles for the photo. None of this is to say Trump is some mastermind. He isn't. He's chaotic, transactional, and often makes decisions on instinct. But chaos has its own logic, and when you're a smaller power trying to manage a larger one, the worst thing you can do is make yourself look desperate for approval. Desperation is not leverage. Obsequiousness is not diplomacy. Bagpipers and gold carriages are not a foreign policy. Britain deserves better than this. Not better in the sense of being coddled or being told everything is fine. Better in the sense of honest leadership. A government willing to say plainly to the British public, this relationship is costing us. Here is what we're getting. Here is what we're giving up. And here is what we think the long-term plan is. Instead, we get reassurances that the deal is historic and the investment is record-breaking and the bond is unlike any other in the world. All while the man you just threw the biggest party in modern British political history for turns his back and keeps talking. That's Britain unfiltered, and we'll keep watching.